You're not going to have a great team if you're only hiring rock star senior principal analysts. That's not going to work. There's no harmony in that. Candidates don't leave because of money. They leave because they're unhappy in their job or they're unhappy with their manager. To me, it's hard to understand how somebody can't have a passion for their job. And if you can't feel that in an interview, you're definitely not going to feel it in a day-to-day. If you as a hiring manager have doubts, probably best not to hire the person.
Mark, one thing I'd love to hear from you is when you think about hiring data talent right now in this market, what are the leading challenges, the leading pain points that you see at the moment?
I think finding the perfect cultural fit for the organization is something that is always important and true. And maybe that's also just like because of the company I'm currently in, because at Sebdesk, there's a lot of focus put on to making sure that we have a really good composition in not only our team, but in the entire company. So the first company I ever joined that actually they did a culture slot in my interview process. There was a half an hour where I met with their culture ambassadors. That to me was like really telling to how important that topic is for them. So maybe that's why it's more top of mind for me. But that being said, I still think that it's no matter how big your organization is or how big your team is, that's really important to understand, like making sure you get the right person for the right job at the right time. And that's also because I think team dynamics make a huge difference in the performance. It's not so much only the individual person, it's how does he or she really fit into like your team at the moment. You're not going to have a great team if you're only hiring rock star senior principal analysts. That's not going to work. There's no harmony in that. You need like diversity in maturity, in background, all of these things. So that to me is more like this, what is important to me. Obviously, given like the current dynamics, there's around like Gen AI developments, it's potentially having to adapt your hiring process to the realities of an AI world. You know, candidates can look up answers on the fly, where most people do remote interviews. Kind of changes. I would say a take-home case study used to have a very different potential like clarity, because you would know that somebody really did that work. Now, they still obviously did the work, but they maybe had some different help than they may have had a couple of years ago in doing that. So I think you kind of have to adjust what kind of case studies you provide, for instance. And what's also always true, might be even more true now. I would say like 2+ years ago, there really, really was like a scarcity of talent. It was really hard to find good candidates, and you really had to kind of woo them and make sure like you really, really want to put the company and your role in the best light. And you would be lucky if you got good talent. I think that has changed a bit now. So I think it's back to, at least in the data and analytics field, it's back to reducing the CV to interview mismatch quota. Like, because you want to reduce the number of interviews that you need to do, because you'll have a lot of CVs on your table. So I think that was probably also the case 10 years ago. It's just it's gone through a change cycle.
Yeah, and I guess hiring goes through that from time to time. And as you say, a couple of years ago, it was scarcity. So then it was all about reducing the hiring process, as few steps as possible. Don't do anything that's going to scare a candidate off. Like, we've just got so few to choose from. I remember in Australia in particular, maybe even more so than Europe, because we had closed borders during COVID. We had no migration at all for like 2 years. And particularly in our tech and data sector, I'd say the vast majority of people are overskilled, skilled migrants. So if we don't have that inflow of new people, we don't have anyone to do any of the jobs. So it led to such strange market conditions where some of the salaries, as you can imagine, shot up by 50% in just 6 months. And employers were fighting over such a small number of candidates. That's where you get, the only work 4 days a week, work from home forever, apparently, what is it? Pet insurance. I heard that as maybe a bit of a joke one in America. I'm not sure if that ever happened here. But now it feels like, yeah, we're back to more normal market, I guess. Like, I don't think it's that drastically bad for candidates. How do you view this over a longer horizon?
That's actually, I think, a really good way of putting it. It's healthy again. Um, I know a couple of years ago, I had several situations where candidates first accepted an offer, and then like a couple of weeks later, or even up to only a week before they were supposed to start the job. And in Germany, right, it's very normal for candidates to say, I'm joining in 3 months, because there's a notice period of 3 months is completely standard. And then like a week before they were supposed to join, which is then a very long time later after signing contract, they're like, oh, sorry, I found a new job. I found a better one. I changed my mind. Because they could really pick and choose, like cherry picking, which, I mean, beyond the fact that I think that's really poor taste to do that, like, you shouldn't do that. But it was a reality that they could. I don't think that's the case anymore. I mean, you'll still have like really good candidates that will have that opportunity, but the job market is in a more healthy, balanced state. I would agree with that.
Yeah. And I remember even ourselves at the peak of COVID hiring a graduate engineer, and they were really good. They were with us for 4 months, fresh grad. They left in 4 months for, I think, 70% higher salary. And we were paying market rates when we employed them. So like, things move so quickly. I feel like that's probably not that helpful to the hiring market, because then you start to get this kind of distrust built in. If candidates are sitting there going, well, I've got another offer for $20,000 more, I can't not take it. Like, it's fair enough in a way. Like, anyone would probably be tempted by that.
They say candidates don't leave because of money. They leave because they're unhappy in their job, or they're unhappy with their manager. With those kind of increases, that just doesn't hold true anymore.
Yeah. And particularly if they haven't joined yet, they haven't built up that socialization in the business, then they probably still view it as an opportunity. It's really interesting also how the tendency to do that, not do that, varies drastically by market. So that would be considered quite rare in Australia, I think, as well, to not join after you've already signed a contract. But in some other markets where we've worked and recruited in the Philippines, it's quite normal that people would renege and actually not turn up or tell you. So it's quite common that you go, oh, where's Joe? Oh, they haven't turned up. Oh, they must have another job. It's sort of baked into the way they do it, which would annoy me no end.
That is definitely a cultural thing. I remember the first time that happened to me, I was like personally offended. I was like, how could somebody do this? This is like, they abused my trust. Well, it's a job. Okay, they did. A personal friend of mine, everything's okay. But in the end of the day, I still think that it's common courtesy to not do something like that. A contract is a contract. Right? It's like a binding handshake deal. And you said you're going to do this, so you have to.
Yeah, I agree with you. But yeah, we shouldn't take it too personally, as you say. One thing you mentioned in passing was that, so cultural fit has always been important, is important now, and probably be important in the future. And you also said that your current organization has a very clearly defined culture. Then I'm interested to hear about your thoughts. Like, did you notice it got measured in the hiring process? Do you try to measure it in the hiring process? Do you ever feel like there's almost a trade-off between things that are a bit more measurable and things that are a little bit less measurable, like culture? Love to hear your thoughts there.
Yeah, that's a really good question, because obviously you can't measure culture. It's not something that you can put on a scale. You can't test somebody in the sense that you can test coding skills. It doesn't work. And culture is also a very fuzzy concept, right? Many companies have a culture that are a couple posters on the wall. But I think the basic thought behind that culture process is two-sided. I think one, it was that it was important for the company to really show that they're serious about the topic. That made an impression on me as a candidate, that they would take the time to have a culture ambassador that has nothing to do with my day-to-day job. I think it was I'm pretty sure there were two people, and one of them was from customer support, nothing to do with my analytics and data background. And all they wanted to do is like understand how I interact with my organizations in the past that I've worked with. What is the concept of culture in a job context actually mean for me, and things like that. And I I try to look out for those cues as well, but I probably wouldn't call that culture. I would call that more like attitude, in the sense of we have a high performance culture. So to me, that also is more of what kind of person are you? Are you willing to go the extra mile? Are you motivated? Or is this for you just a 9 to 5, put the pen down? And it's not about working overtime. It's more about like, do you care? Are you passionate? Maybe that's the right thing. Um, I really care about data and analytics. That's like, to me, it's hard to understand how somebody can't have a passion for their job. Um, and if you can't feel that in an interview, you're definitely not going to feel it in a day to day. So that would be one of the aspects of culture, that I think you can't you can't measure it, but you can feel it. It sounds really like I know. It's hard for me to describe because I think at the one side you're trying to in recruiting you're trying to be as objective as possible, but it is virtually impossible to do that, because it's a really human and personal interaction. There's a certain aspect to it which is numbers. It's how much years of job experience do you have? What kind of companies have you worked for? What kind of like reputation do they have? How good did you solve a case study? How well are you able to communicate verbally and written and, whatever you decide, whatever is important to your role. All of those you can, I think, very well kind of check some boxes. But once you get into that actual interview, I think all of that is gone. It's basically very much about how the person is interacting, being able to respond to your questions and all these, like, how do you interact with them? And that's like a really like personal thing to do. But to get back to the original question of like, how do you measure culture? I think everybody in their head, like high performance culture, is this person super driven? A community driven company that cares about doing after work social activities, does that resonate? A open feedback culture, does somebody get personally offended if you challenge them on what's that weird gap in your CV? I've had that. I've had people that got offended. Like, I don't think I have to be answering this kind of question right now. Well, that you're clearly not open to critical questioning and feedback. If you can't do that in a job interview, you won't do that in real life at your job. And so I think that's how you can basically vet for culture.
Yeah, I have to say I'm personally been a little bit in two minds about this over the years because we've when we first started hiring for our business, we didn't think of this at all. We didn't really have a clearly defined culture, or at least not one that was written down that we'd consciously thought about and discussed. We hired our first set of people, many of whom for various reasons didn't work out. It was at that point then we sat down thinking, I'm like, we're missing something here. So we tried to think really concretely about what our values are and maybe what we want them to be. So it's like slightly aspirational as well as what it currently was. Managed to reduce it down to 8, still probably too many, but still, that's what we got to. And then we thought, okay, well, can we somehow align our hiring process to this? What we came up with was then trying to see if we could measure any of these in the hiring process, we would do them. Where I got to was the fact that a lot of them, a lot of companies would tend to do like a behavioral interview for a value and be like, give me an example of when you've done X. X is the value. So it could be like teamwork or leadership or communication skills, or to your point, maybe it's like openness to criticism. But I felt like that's very easy for a candidate to get through if they're well prepared and they thought through it and they kind of know what to expect. Like a coached candidate is going to nail that interview. But what you did was interesting because it kind of aligns with what we settled on, which was, actions speak louder than words. If there's a way that they could have a chance to actually demonstrate it in their behavior in the process, that would be way more indicative. So the fact that you would like dig in and almost critique them a little bit and see how they react, I think that's really clever because you can't, unless you're super clever as a candidate, you can't really think forward to that. Hang on, this is part of the test. And so that's really fascinating that you took that approach.
Yeah. So one thing that I believe works the best to really understand how a person is put them in a real life environment. And given that many interviews happen fully remote, that doesn't work as well anymore. But what I used to do is I used to try to make sure that I add a half an hour coffee talk, or even like have them join the team, the candidate have to join the team for lunch, because they're sitting at that lunch table, they will forget that they are actually still in an interview process, because it is. I mean, it's still an interview process, but for them, hey, I'm at lunch with a couple people, and they will start acting their normal self. Basically, they let their guard down, and then they just act their normal self. And I have had some very positive experience. I've also had some very awkward ones where, like, I don't know if I would say that in an interview process, but okay, here we are. Because they just completely forgot that this is actually still an interview, and they started talking about, I mean, there's nothing wrong with talking about personal things, but personal things that are borderline, like, you shouldn't be sharing this with your colleagues, even at work, let alone if you don't have the job yet. So that was, I think, a real revelation for me, to show like the formality of the interview has people their guard up and knowing, like, I need to say, they are expecting me to say this. And so I will try to understand. I'd say an intelligent person will oftentimes not say what they think. They will say what the person thinks, what they think the person wants them to hear or to say. Yeah, that way around.
Yeah. And that, I guess, is part of the challenge with interviews, and why they are often not the best indicator of whether or not someone's going to excel in the role, because it's a bit of an act. It's a lot about crafting these narratives, these stories, quite biased towards people who are maybe a bit quite confident, who are good blaggers, who've thought through a lot of this and are well planned. Maybe some of those things are correlated with success anyway, like being really well planned and organized. Fair enough. Who wouldn't want that in a candidate? But I feel like for a lot of data roles that are the individual contributor, largely technical kind of role, I could see how a lot of interview structures aren't probably selecting the best people a lot of the times. What do you think about that?
There's two aspects to that. One of them, you don't have to be really good, like, speaker and very social to just do good preparation, I think. So what I always try to look out for is, did somebody really do their homework? And that starts with, if I ask something about the company and you have no idea about the company, you didn't do your homework. If, like, the presentation, if the one of the parts of the, like, take home test is a presentation and there's typos in there and it's just really sloppy, that's not good preparation. So that's something where I think you can try to remove that bias towards more like vocal, communicative, really self-assured people. And I try to really ignore if people get nervous, things like that. Like, that does not matter to me at all. But where I've seen even like the most, what we say, orative, like very suave communicator, where it falls apart is if you dig on questions, because they'll have their answers ready. But if you go and say, like, can you elaborate on that a little more? No, I really want to understand that. I need to go dig deeper. If they don't know what they're talking about, if they've just kind of prepped a couple of like taglines, that's what my experience is what separates a good interviewer from just somebody who doesn't really care, who's just trying to ask their question. Like, give me an example of where you had a challenging interaction in your previous company and how did you deal with that? And then they answer that and they're like, okay, move on. They had an answer to that. But if you think, okay, but why was that now a problem? Why did you decide to deal with that? What could have been an alternative path? Do you think you really solved that in a good way? You can really challenge the person, that they have to explain that more. And that has nothing to do with good or bad communication. That's just people, then their brain really starts to work. They start to reflect, hopefully, on that real situation that happened. And that's where you can tell if they did or not, or if they just thought of a stupid answer to provide because they knew this question was going to come anyway.
Yeah, digging down and not just taking the first response is so important. And it must not only help the candidate demonstrate their depth of knowledge or understanding, also how intricately they were actually involved in a project. I know a lot of interviewers would complain about a candidate saying, referring to a team project they were on, and it turns out they did like this tiny slither of it, and really they weren't actually involved at all. And once you start digging, that becomes immediately apparent. Very interestingly, as an analogy, I feel like traditional interviews then are almost sometimes too superficial and allow a candidate who's at like a high level talker to get through maybe the first round, maybe as you go through a hiring process, that lessens as soon as you start speaking to the hiring manager themselves, who can really dig in. I wonder now if politics is quite similar, because politicians have been used to just talking in these kind of sound bites. They just need to get through that like quick Q&A session. They're not going to dig in. But now that's changing, because we're moving to the podcast format. People are going to go on for 3-4 hours at a time. The interview is going to have an opportunity to really dig in. And so I wonder if politicians are going to have to become a bit more depth oriented, not just superficial, flashy, and candidates would have to do the same if they want to pass a really in-depth interview. And that's a long bow to draw. What do you think about that?
I don't think that politicians are going to develop to be more knowledgeable. Unfortunately, I think it's the opposite. It's being proven that politicians don't have to know very much at all. All they have to do is have really good talking points, and it doesn't even have to be fact-based. It just has to be something that people care about and people are emotional about, and that works. But that's always worked. So I would say no. Politics is a different beast that I don't want to get into. But candidates, I think I'm a fan of long interview processes. And I know candidates hate them, but I think it's really good to spend a lot of time with candidates and have those different aspects. So if we do a panel, like we purposefully have people from different roles that are then basically have the clear mandate to vet a candidate, like from a more technical perspective, from a product perspective, from an engineering perspective, and that takes time. We do it in a panel because we try to be a little nicer to candidates. I've seen processes where you sit down a half an hour or 45 minutes with the engineering director, with the product director, and especially in like functional roles that have intersections or overlaps with many different areas, that makes a lot of sense. Because you can get grilled for 45 minutes by a CTO or an engineering director. That's a difficult conversation to have if that's not your core field of expertise, but it's a necessary step. So I definitely don't think you have to go like assessment center style hiring process. That is maybe a little over the top, but longer processes with in-depth conversations, not just these very superficial, repetitive stuff. I've seen that as well. Basically, you go in and people are asking the same questions. Everybody's asking those same questions because all they're trying to understand is, what type of person are you? What is your team dynamic? That's one important part, but it is, again, only one important part. There's many other aspects that make that separate a good candidate from a really great candidate, which is really, really hard to identify in an interview, to be honest. You kind of have to go with gut feeling sometimes at the end, but we try our best, right?
It sounds like then the process you're running, at least at the moment, is optimized to reduce the chance of a bad hire at some level, like to really make sure you get the right candidate, as you said, for the right job at the right time. Is that partly driven by the conditions in Germany, where, as you say, you have that 3-month notice, 3-month notice period, also quite a long probation, if I'm not mistaken.
6 months.
So it's difficult to have a candidate in week one and go, this is not the right candidate, I'm going to get rid of them. It's not like a sort of cutthroat American market where if you make a hiring decision that was wrong, you just fire them and move on. It's quite difficult to do that. So does that almost breed a little bit of risk aversion, do you think?
Technically, you have 6 months to make sure that your candidate really is good, because in those 6 months, you can let go of any candidate with a 2-week notice anytime. You do not have to provide a reason. You could just say, I've just decided this is not going to work, or you don't even have to say that. Sorry to let you know, but I mean, obviously that's not very nice to do that. But you can. So interestingly, actually, there shouldn't be that high of a risk aversion to hire people where you might not be sure. The reality is that I think most hiring managers don't make use of probationary periods, at least in Germany, because I think to a certain degree, some hiring managers, it feels to them like it's like a personal, like they made the mistake, right? There was something very personal to like, well, no, I did hire the wrong candidate. I also think that there's this human interaction part to it, to say like, well, that's not very nice letting somebody go that just found this new job, because it's a very tedious process to find a good new job. But it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be risk aversion that's leading you to your hiring process. You should be hiring to make sure you get the best candidates. And I just learned this statement from an HR colleague: when in doubt, out. I was like, okay, yeah, I see where you're coming from. If you have a doubt about a candidate, don't hire them, because I don't think that's fair. Don't hire a candidate where you're not quite sure, with having in the back of your mind, well, I can just let him go in 2 months anyway if I don't like him, if it doesn't work out, because that doesn't seem very fair. But if you have, I have done that. I have hired candidates where I thought, like, I'm not sure, parts of this, I think this could be really great, but there's something in there that I think it might not be. And they've turned out to be really good candidates. And in the back of my head, I did have that thought, well, if it doesn't work out, I can let them go within the 6-month probationary period, because I mean, that's my job as a hiring manager, to make sure I get the best talent into the team. And if it doesn't work out, I have to make that tough call to let people go in a probationary period.
That's interesting. And the phrase, when in doubt, out, I get that. And I've certainly seen that firsthand. I noticed that the longer a hiring process is, the lower the chance of a candidate ultimately getting an offer, especially if there's more and more people involved, because someone will always find a reason to not like a candidate. I think if there's enough people involved, especially if there's any kind of subjectivity in the criteria of what you're evaluating, someone will get out of bed on the wrong side in a day, having had their coffee, their girlfriend yelled at them or whatever, and they'll come into that interview at 9 a.m. and they probably won't be in the right mindset to evaluate a very gray thing like, is this person the right fit for our team? So I feel like that it's got a slightly dangerous downside, and one that isn't often measured. Like everyone remembers making a bad hire. Nobody remembers not making a good hire, because there's thousands of candidates to choose from. And so I feel like there's another side to that coin.
Yeah, you never know what great candidates you actually missed. Although when I say that, when in doubt, out, I think that boils down to, does the hiring manager have a doubt? It would never work if you say, as soon as anyone in the interview process has a doubt. To me, everybody else in the hiring process is a consulting person that helps the hiring manager get a very differentiated, broad picture and feedback. The way we handle it at the moment, and I like that, is even if people say like, I would vote no, I wouldn't hire this person, the critical question then behind that is that a veto, or is that just that you wouldn't hire them? And if somebody gives a veto, that basically is that I have so many red flags here. I don't think I could work together with this. This would be a huge problem. I've done that once. I've hired against the resistance I even hired a lead against the resistance of the team, because I was like, no, I think this is a perfect fit for you. It was a disaster. It did not work out. I would never do that again. But beyond that, if people just, I don't think it was the best candidate, I'm not so sure. You try to collect the reasons behind it, try to like get that full picture, and only the hiring manager knows exactly what they're looking for. And I think has the full picture of the candidate, the position, the team dynamics, what they actually need right now. And it's their call. And what I meant is if you as a hiring manager have doubts, probably best not to hire the person.
Yeah. I think we added the phrase captain's call to our dictionary in Australia about 8 or 9 years ago. One of our prime ministers was a fan of that phrase. It sounds like, yeah, captain's call. You're the one ultimately accountable for this person being successful. You have the full picture, taking the data points from other people, but end of the day, it's your decision.
Yeah, I think that's correct. That would be a captain's call in that moment because you're the captain of your hiring process.
Do you feel like there's ways currently that you could make the hiring process more objective? Have you put in place any things? Are there any interesting examples of making processes a bit fairer, a bit more objective that you've come across?
Well, I think in the first step, a semi-automated screening process, I think could help because that will naturally remove bias that people have in vetting CVs, because I think it already happens there. That's already the first place where people will have their prejudices baked into their quick screening. Because if you do a 30-second screen of a CV, you read so much information where it is super easy to be like, well, this candidate I don't find good, even though actually if you would just like look at the raw information that's there that is relevant, if you define this is my relevant set of information, this many years of experience, these different like tools and technologies that they have to have used, and you can define all that. I think that definitely would help, and I think AI based like recruiting processes will make that even better because those have existed in the past. Potentially because it makes it a little more nuanced. Because if you just say, well, I'm going to cut out everybody with less than 5 years of work experience, or I'm going to cut out everybody that doesn't have a PhD, you might be missing on some good candidates. But if you can have an algorithm that really basically gives you a quality scoring based on the things provided, I think that can help. I think the second thing that would help, I mean, I don't know how much that's a thing in Australia, but I'm seeing more and more CVs that don't have pictures, don't have age, don't have change of, well, there's always a name. But I mean, removing all these things that it's just human. So it was interesting. I was doing some research on AI tools, just Gen AI, and then I also did some on HR, and I found a tool that was advertising that they could automate screening through one-way interviews. I guess it's you just record yourself talking and then people can watch 5 minutes of it and then make a decision. And I thought that sounds like the opposite of removing bias, because all you're doing is looking at people and how they talk for 5 minutes. There's no substance in that. It's just, do I like your face? I think that, how can that be a good improvement of a recruiting process? Because I think you want to remove that. And what I'm getting at is, I think it's important to have a panel, different people, different backgrounds in your hiring process. And I do mean here now technical backgrounds in the sense of, because an engineering, marketing, product, data analyst, they will have a very different criteria for what makes a good candidate. I think that's a good thing. I am very skeptical of trying to really standardize interview processes, because in my experience, it doesn't work. And that's because I've lived through the experience and I found it to be really, for a lack of a better word, it seemed silly because it was so flawed in its process, this highly standardized interview where everybody gets a fair chance and it knows exactly what's expected of them, but that removes the whole purpose of an interview process.
it removes the purpose in what sense? Because it's too like manufactured or something like that.
If you want to understand how good somebody's coding skills is, you can do a coding challenge. That is objective. But if you try to understand how good is somebody in their strategic thinking, in their application of data knowledge to product management, how well do you understand business processes, systems thinkings, you name whatever you're looking for, that is an inherently individual um, pers- discussion that has to unfold dynamically in an interview process. Actually, no interview should be the same, because even if you give them a take this challenge home, don't give them a lot of context, everybody will come up with an entirely different interpretation of also numbers, way to visualize it, way to communicate it, structure. It's all different. And so I was in a interview process for what's known as the FANG, the big American, so Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Google, I think is what that stands for. And they've tried, because they have so many candidates, to standardize, which basically I got a pamphlet beforehand, 7 days in advance, that said, this is exactly what you're going to expect. And this is what they're looking out for. And these are the answers you basically should be giving. And I was like, what's the point of this interview then? It seemed really weird but the idea was to obviously remove bias, make sure everybody gets a fair chance. But what then happens is you get that. And then if you provide exactly that, every interviewer is bored out of their minds because they've heard it 100 times because everybody says the exact same thing. And then that leads to an interviewer saying like, yeah, I don't care about those answers. Tell me something else. And then they just start to chat to you for a half an hour. And I was like, well, okay, that was obviously completely off the point. That's why, I mean, it doesn't work. I think standardizing for that part of the interview process doesn't work. There are certain aspects that work. There's some where you just have to allow for that individual communication and exchange between interviewer and interviewee. That's what it's there for. It's to have that unexpected turn, and all of a sudden you ask a question and somebody lights up because that's what they're totally passionate about, and then they like to talk about it and they want to go deep into it or whatever it is. I think that's what it's there for. That's what I mean when I say I think standardization of the human interaction in an interview process doesn't work.
Yeah, it's so tricky, isn't it? Because as you say, it sounds like they've kind of over standardized it. It's mechanized. It's so specific that it doesn't allow for a candidate to deviate from the very narrow set of things you're discussing with them in the way that a take-home project does, because it could just go off in any direction. And the way they approach it says so much about how they think and their skills in so different ways. Whereas if you narrowly restrain them, by definition, they can't kind of impress you outside the box. The way or the reason they would do it, I assume, is because they have such a stupendous amount of data over hiring patterns for years with, as you say, tens of thousands of candidates, where they can optimize and are actually measuring some of the stuff that most companies aren't measuring around conversion rates at different steps and success on the job. I'm assuming there's a reason they've done it, but it sounds like they've kind of taken it too far and now it's ineffective because, as you say, the interviewers themselves are deviating from it and realizing that it's too mechanized. Maybe there's something in between that would be still objective and structured, but would allow candidates to demonstrate those things outside the box. I don't know. What do you reckon?
It's an interesting thought. Like where should the pendulum swing? Because obviously you don't want this complete freestyle. You do want some more common patterns. Like what I try to do is since every job that I'm hiring for is slightly different, I won't ask the exact same questions in every interview. Even if it's, you're hiring for an analyst, now I'm hiring for an analyst again, it'll be, is it a junior, mid-level, or senior? Which team is he in? Where is that team currently, and what do I need? What I try to do is ask the same questions repetitively in the interview process of the candidates, because that at least allows me to compare the answers that were given. Sometimes, like I would say, I have like a core set of 5 to 7 questions, and then I'll have additional. Then I'll just kind of deviate from that narrative based on the interactions I'm having with the candidate or whatever they prepared and are presenting. But that's something I do try to do. I remember when I was a fresh lead, I got a pamphlet. It's like 300 questions across different dimensions that you can ask for good candidate experience. And I remember I would, I like marked those that I really liked, and then I started using those again and again. And I think that's where I came from. That's how I developed that pattern of recognizing asking the same questions definitely helps, because then you're really kind of judging on the same questions. So that's a good thing to do. Not only are you judging on the same like case study, you're also judging on the same questions. Interviews should not be completely freestyle because that allows for way too much bias. But they also shouldn't be completely standardized to the degree that then people are taking trainings to ace your interview. There's something wrong with that. That's like doing an SAT preparation test for college. That's weird.
I feel like also part of the detriment for those companies is because they have so many candidates are likely to share this information, put it online. So it's like a whole prep industry of how to get a job at Fang. Whereas for a smaller business, that would never be the case. So maybe with a structured approach, it might work a little bit better for them because the questions aren't leaked, the answers aren't leaked. The interviewers probably haven't also asked the same question 8,000 times that year because there's not the same volume of candidates. So maybe they've kind of shot themselves in the foot a little bit with how successful they've been.
Yeah, to a certain degree, I think so. And I mean, that was the saying 15, 20 years ago. Yeah, I think so. The consultancies were trying to be clever and ask like brain teasers. And then everybody was just trying to prepare on how best to solve absurd brain teasers, like how many tennis balls fit into a jumbo jet.
The other one that was really common, I remember, was what's the angle between the minute and hour hand on a clock if it's 3:15, because it's meant to be like a trick question. And so that's one I personally had in multiple investment banking and management consulting interviews. So yeah, again, the candidates start to prep, and then it's really not as spontaneous as it should be.
Which basically, I think all it says is you always have to innovate on your interview process. I probably that's the key thing. Don't always use the same case. Which, by the way, I've both been in a case study and I've been the culprit that used like a super outdated case study where candidates were like really irritated, like because oftentimes case studies are like a semi-reflection of your business. But then there was like some old like internationalization concept and you ad hoc had to look into the numbers. It's like, are you guys planning to do this? Oh, no, this is 4 years old. That's not a good thing. You shouldn't be building on the same case study for years. You should always update it to make sure it reflects the current way technology can be used, the state of your organization, and to stay innovative, to have new ideas that you bring into how you do the interview.
Yeah, that's such an underappreciated tip, actually. I can think of two relevant examples. I can remember one business coming to us just for a bit of feedback. They'd gotten a referral to speak to us, and they shared with me that their case study that they were using to hire a data analyst. And this business didn't really have an analytics team. So, they were doing their best to hire someone that was well outside of their normal remit. And the questions looked reasonable, looking through each of them. And then they got to one, and it was getting the candidates to do some kind of analysis in VBA specifically. You had to use VBA in Excel. Like, well, there's the problem. Because like, oh yeah, they remembered, oh yeah, some candidate had mentioned something about VBA and macros or whatever, and not knowing anything about it. I'm like, yeah, it's not 2007 anymore or whatever. Like, there's other tools they're going to use. And it's only just negative. It's actually, it's not only just neutral, it's negative, because the candidate will then be thinking, oh my God, am I going to get into Excel hell? Are you telling me there's no warehouse? I can't even, maybe I'm not even allowed to use Python. You're going to force me to use macros and VBA. No, thank you.
Exactly. Yeah. That's exactly what I was going for. It's important for both sides. It can be very off-putting to a candidate.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned earlier innovating your hiring process. Well, AI is innovating everything. How have you seen it impact the hiring process already, or the way that candidates approach it, the way that companies approach it? What do you imagine is going to happen over the next couple of years?
I think the one part where it's become really apparent is that it's changed the dynamic of take-home case studies that include a lot of text and research. Those candidate processes, I think, have become a lot more difficult for hiring managers to navigate because it has become so much easier to just ask ChatGPT to summarize this question to, then you use, what's the, I forgot the name of the tool for PowerPoint. They just build your slides for you. There's so much where, like, I've been now over the past 12 months, I've been in interviews where I thought, like, I'm 99% sure you didn't do that yourself. And you can't tell you can tell candidates to not do it, but you would also kind of argue, what's the point? They will do that in their daily business as well. So how do you vet a candidate for good research and storytelling? Because not everything can be answered by ChatGPT and summarized. I think that part is the most difficult one that's really changed. Obviously, around, like, I think process improvements, those I think I've seen that, just automated scheduling, CV screening, that part of the hiring process, I think, is more heavily impacted. But I think you were going more for the actual interview process or how you deal with candidates. There, I think it's yet. I haven't kind of made up my mind on how I'd potentially need to actually entirely change the process. Like, we still provide our candidates with the data set, tell them to prepare it, because yeah, you can use assistants for that. In the end, you still have to do the work, and it still gives us a good sense of how you interpret and the data and how do you visualize it. But there are more assistants out there that can help you do that than it was in the past. So basically, I think it's getting harder to really understand how good a candidate really is, because you don't know how much assistance and help they're getting in the background.
Yeah, and I wonder if, like, on the take-home case study front, maybe it's just approaching it in the same way we would have a couple of years ago, which is they do the case study. There was always a tiny chance that maybe they hadn't done it all themselves anyway. They might have gotten their friend to help them with it. You never know. It's kind of unlikely because it's such a specific skill set that it's not like, unless they happen to be in the data community or whatever, they might not have a lot of people they could lean on. And so in that follow-up interview where you're digging into it, it probably becomes quite apparent straight away if they haven't done it, because they would only have that superficial knowledge of it. Whereas if they'd literally written every line of code, researched it, written every word of that document, they should be able to go to a fairly low depth of understanding. I imagine it might be the same with ChatGPT. If they've just bunged that into ChatGPT and edited a few things here and there, maybe they can answer superficial questions, but they're unlikely to be able to really, buttress that as you dig deeper and deeper.
And I mean, that's why, and that's back to the point of the interview is really important. If we're talking about an individual contributor analytics, data analytics position, there's a take it home case study. They take it home, they prepare it. They have to send it in advance. They have to provide their code in advance. And then there will be an analyst or an analytics engineer in the interview that will challenge them on why did they decide to build that code the way they did. And that's where you then get into a conversation, and you can't fake that. That's not going to work. So you can fake it at home, but once you have somebody sitting in an interview asking you why you decided to build your code structure the way you did, your answer is, I don't know. Basically, that's what Copilot suggested. Then you have a problem. Then you're not going to pass the interview. So I think it shifts the responsibility and vetting more into the interview, actually even more into the interview. I don't think, not yet at least, um, do I think that there's no point in doing the take home, but forcing people to do it like live. You have a half an hour, because I do acknowledge that people have different ways of working. And I think that is biased towards people that can deal with high stress situations in a half an hour quickly, like code. Don't know if that really is a fair process.
No, I can say personally, I would have hated that. I remember my last role that was in an office, which is a few years ago now. I would, write a fair bit of SQL. If someone came over to my desk and said, "Hey, can you just run me this quick query?" and I had to sit there typing SQL, I became like a seal. Like I didn't actually have fingers anymore. I was just mashing the keyboard wildly. I'm like, just go away. Give me 5 minutes. I'll come and give you the data in a minute. I can't sit here under this pressure. You staring at me.
Yeah, don't watch me doing this. Yeah, although I've had a really good interview process that was memorable to me was for when I was in finance. I would join an FP&A interview process, and they would have a seemingly very simple set of charts already visualized and a slight outline of like this situation. I think it was like market growth, whatever. And then they would give that to a candidate and say, "You have 20 minutes. Look at this, and then we're going to have a discussion about what you read there. What do you actually see in those numbers?" And it was amazing how different the outcome, what people were able to interpret. And I think people, an analyst, and FP&A is also an analyst, different type, but anyway, should be able to do that. So there is merit to spontaneous preparation. Just coding, I think, is a little different. I think some people really need their zone, their music and exactly their environment that they've been accustomed to be able to really excel on that. And I think that's fair. I want to give the people the time at home to do that.
Indeed. Well, Mark, one final question. Can you think of a hiring hero or anyone in your experience who's done hiring in a great way? This could be a person, it could even be a business. Has anyone spring to mind?
So in my hiring experience, I've always tried to learn from peers that I got to join in the interview process. And there was definitely one that stood out. That was my former boss and CFO at Mobile. Her name was Patricia. And I'd never met someone that was able to do what we talked about, the digging deeper. And it was on point. The questions were really tough, but in a friendly manner that it felt completely appropriate. Because I think there's always a balance of, you want to have a nice and positive interview environment, but you also want to challenge the people. You want to you really want to dig deeper. And how do you balance that? And she did it, like, it was perfect. Every time I was like, "How are you doing this?" It was amazing to just watch. And I've tried to emulate that when I do interviews, because I try to give the candidates a positive experience, because I'm trying to also, I want them to join my company, right? Like, I want them to join my team. At the same time, I want to ask tough questions, but how do you balance that? That to me is like the perfect combination.
Wonderful.